Welcome to the Play Podcast with me, Douglas Schatz. Hello, and welcome to episode 15 of the Play Podcast, where we explore the greatest new and classic plays. I'm Douglas Schatz, founder and host of the Play Podcast. The curtain rises today on an apartment in Paris, where André is talking with his daughter Anne. Anne is somewhat anxious and angry because she has received a telephone call from a woman who has been upset by something that has happened with her father. André says that he has no idea who the woman was, but according to Anne, he has apparently lashed out at her, calling her a little bitch and threatening her with a curtain rod. The woman, it appears, was his carer, who has just walked out in response to his attack on her. This is the opening of Florian Zeller's unsettling and painful play, The Father, which presents a piercing portrait of a family living with dementia. Florian Zeller is a French playwright and novelist, and the play premiered in Paris in 2012, winning the 2014 Molière Award for Best Play. The Father was translated into English by Christopher Hampton and opened at the Theatre Royal Bath in 2014 before transferring to the Tricycle in London and then to the West End for 2 runs. It was also produced on Broadway in 2016 and has won both Olivier and Tony Awards for Best Actor in the title role for Kenneth Branagh and Frank Langella respectively. The Father has also now been made into a feature film, directed by Zeller and co-written with Christopher Hampton, and with a stellar cast headed by Anthony Hopkins and Olivia Coleman. The film was shown at the Sundance and Toronto Film Festivals earlier this year and will be released, we hope, in the UK in January 2021, all being well. So this is a celebrated and important play, as I'm honored to say is my guest on the podcast today, who is none other than Sir Christopher Hampton, the translator of the original play and co-writer of the film screenplay. Sir Christopher is a renowned playwright and screenwriter whose plays have so far garnered 4 Tony Awards, 3 Oliviers, and 5 Evening Standard Awards. His work for film and television has won him an Oscar for the screenplay based on his play Les Liaisons Dangereuses, as well as 2 BAFTAs, a Special Jury Award at Cannes, the Prix Italia, and a Writers Guild of America. Time and space will not permit me to begin to list all of his work, other than to quickly remind you of a few notable titles from his own plays, which include Total Eclipse, The Philanthropist, and Tales from Hollywood, translations of classics from Ibsen, Chekhov, Molière, as well as Yamina Reza's God of Carnage and Art. His screenplays include Carrington, The Quiet American, and Atonement, to name just 3, for which he received another Oscar nomination. I'm afraid that I've still barely skimmed the surface of his achievements by citing these, but in the interest of our subject today, the most relevant credit is that in addition to The Father, he has translated no fewer than 4 more of Florian Zeller's plays, including The Mother, The Son, The Truth, The Lie, and The Height of the Storm. Sir Christopher was knighted in the New Year's Honours List in January this year for services to drama. He joins me today during our latest version of coronavirus lockdown by video link. Welcome, Christopher. Thanks for joining me.
Pleasure.
So as I said, you have translated a number of Florian plays, and I wanted to start by asking you how you first came across him and what drew you to translate his work, and in particular, of course, The Father.
Well, I think since starting translating Yasmina Reza's plays and with the success of Art and God of Carnage, I did tend to get quite a lot of plays sent to me from Paris, inviting me to translate them. And I sort of heard in a roundabout way about a play by Florian Zeller called The Truth. And I went to see it in Paris, and I suppose about 2012. And I thought it was a very good play, but I thought it would require really, really skillful direction. Meanwhile, I heard that he had a new play called The Father, which I went to see. And that's when I met Florian for the first time and saw this play, which I found, like many people who see it, absolutely shattering and beautiful. And so that very evening I said to him, look, I'd love to translate this play, but I think this should be the first play of yours that reaches an English-speaking public, because I felt confident that it would sort of explode him onto the scene with a great bang. And so that's the way round we did it. I also translated the truth, but we decided to do the father first.
Well, you were right. It did explode onto the scene, and it has I think, a depth and a power that, with all due respect to the truth, is it's more profound. So I think it was better that way around.
Yes, actually it's a completely different kind of exercise. One of the impressive things about Florian is that he can write two such different sorts of play, seemingly at the drop of obviously no play is written at the drop of a hat, but he does write plays very, very fast and regularly.
Yes, it seems to come easily somehow. You just have that feeling, even that they do come fast, but you also have the feeling and the facility of it and how well it's done. I wondered about the process of translating them when you came to it. It's always been somewhat of a mystery to me, and I wanted to ask you how you approached translating the play. Did you have much dialogue with him about it and about the tone or the intentions of the characters or even the language?
No, no, we didn't sort of discuss it at all. It was a sort of dream collaboration, really, because I translated it, sent it to him, and he said, "Well, this is great. Thank you very much."
Is this how translations usually work? Is it really
No,
a literal exercise?
Well, the whole business of translation is very close to my heart. I started way back at the end of the 60s when I was working at the Royal Court, where they had, at that time, a sort of revolutionary idea, which was that maybe being able to write dialogue was a more important quality for a translator than necessarily academic qualifications or knowledge of the language or knowledge of the author. And the Royal Court instituted this with a series of translations from Chekhov. And then I, by that time, was on the staff of the Royal Court as resident dramatist, and they asked me to translate Uncle Vanya for a production with Paul Schofield and Colin Blakely.
Oh, wow.
And that's when I really sort of discovered the joy of locking yourself away with Chekhov for 2 months and trying to get to the bottom of what he was trying to do. In this, I had a collaborator who was a Russian lady called Nina Fraud, who supplied me with a literal translation, and then act by act, together with Anthony Page, who directed it, went over with me, line by line, the translation. And it was at that time, one of the most enjoyable job I'd been asked to do ever. And the result was a production which only played for 5 or 6 weeks or whatever the standard Royal Court run was. But I think I went to see it about 30 times because Schofield, in particular, was so brilliant in it.
Yeah, why wouldn't you? I would love to have seen Schofield in that role. We did Vanya in the podcast earlier, and it's just wondrous. And I'm intrigued, actually interesting, thinking about what creative input you have, given that you're given a literal translation, and then the final result is clearly not just the literal translation, but you bring your knowledge of drama to it to make it live.
Well, I think sometimes an analogy I make is with the lighting designer, that if you do your job well, no one will notice. So you try to make yourself a pane of glass, you try to make yourself transparent and just serve the piece of work. That this involves kind of, I guess, a skill analogous to that of a director. That's to say that you have to try and work out exactly what it is that the playwright was trying to do, where the playwright wants to make the audience laugh, where he wants to move them, where he wants to shock them, all those kinds of things.
I did a course in directing not that long ago, and at the first session, the tutors asked us all to define what we thought a director did. And the answer that he came up with in the end, and we all sort of collectively came up, was that he was a storyteller. Now, we were all fixated on the technical aspects of what it means to dissect text or direct people on a stage or whatever it is, but fundamentally he was talking about recognizing that the director was also part of the storytelling.
Yeah, you guide the narrative.
Yes, as the translator presumably does.
Yes, but then there are specific technical things that you also do. I mean, one of the things I did, or we did right from the start, from that Uncle Vanya translation, was that I asked for a list of words that repeated, sort of leitmotif words so that I made sure that wherever Chekhov had used a word that corresponded to a word that he'd used in Act One, I always chose the same English word for both those things. That was, and that proved to be even more important in the next translation I did, which was Hedda Gabler, which I did with Peter Gill, who'd been invited to direct it at the Stratford Festival in Ontario, Canada.
I might have seen that.
In 1970.
Might have been a bit young.
Yes, you probably are. It was with Irene Worth.
Oh, I know her, yes.
And very good cast from the theatre company. And in starting to translate Ibsen, one discovered that this sort of patterning, especially of vocabulary, was even more central to Ibsen than to Chekhov. And for example, in Hedda Gabler, the Norwegian word, which means to dare, is used over and over again. And it gives you a clue that what the play is about is not a woman who's being sort of capriciously wicked or perverse or any of those things. It's about a woman who can't forgive herself for not daring to do what she wants to do, what she really passionately wants to do. And Ibsen threads these motifs all the way through his plays very, very deliberately. So
you're obviously paying respect to the original text in the sense that the playwright has made these decisions about his language as carefully as you've described, and therefore respecting what the intent was in so doing.
Yes.
When it comes to the father, were there any particular repeating words or things that came out of this process for you that led you?
What we've been talking about actually is a translation from languages I don't know. So I don't know Russian. I don't know Norwegian, but I do know German. So that my method for translating Ibsen was to get hold of the original German translation, which he supervised himself because for nearly 20 years he was putting his plays on first in Germany.
Mm-hmm.
And by looking at the German version and the Norwegian version next to one another, you could find your way in without having. I usually had a literal translation for safety, but I didn't really use them that much. Now, with later translations, I translated several plays by a writer called Odin von Horvath, and yet with Yasmina, and eventually with Florian. I was then moving on to languages which I understood, or which I studied, because French and German was what I studied at university, and so it was a different thing, and I'm sort of avoiding as much as I can generalization, because I think every author requires a different approach. I think Yasmina is much more sort of linguistically agile, or uses unusual phrases much more than many writers, and therefore sets you a particular set of problems. And also she participates with an eagle eye and questions anything that she finds doubtful. Florian is different, and I must choose my words carefully here, because it's not that. It's that his language is very straightforward and simple, and he's not interested, as many writers are, in language for language's sake. He's interested in language performing a function. What he is interested in is the possibilities and techniques of the theatre, so that all his plays have sort of remarkable, unusual kinds of devices, theatrical devices in them, which also belongs to a sort of French tradition. There was a writer called Anouilh, I'm sure you remember him, in the 50s, who was also similar. It was not at all like Florian temperamentally, but was similarly interested in what the theatre could do that you hadn't seen in the theatre before.
Yes.
And I think that's what Florian is really interested in, and to that extent, I mean, his plays are easier to translate, in fact, than anybody else's that I've translated.
Well, I think you're right about the father, at least, and in that the language is relatively straightforward. And of course, I think we're going to come and talk. I'd like to talk about the form of the play because you rightly identified that there's some innovation or experimentation going on in the way he structures the play. So let's actually, for the benefit of listeners who haven't had the privilege of seeing the play or read it, I wonder if we could just do a brief summary of who the characters are and what the main setup of what the scenario is of what is happening in the play.
Well, as you described, the play opens with a girl, Anne, a woman, visiting her father because there's been this sort of ruckus in which he's physically attacked the woman who's trying to care for him and driven her out of the house. He claims not to be able to remember this at all. But it looks as if you're at the start of a kind of not unconventional story in which a man of sort of considerable personality is sort of losing his mind because of the onset of dementia or Alzheimer's or something like that. And so so for the first, I suppose, 15 minutes of the play, that's where you are. So that's a familiar place to be. Anne then leaves, and in the next scene, Andre, the main character, finds himself in a room with a man that he doesn't know, who claims to be his son-in-law. And so he's trying to pretend that he can remember that he's his son-in-law, but he's not sure that whether he is or not. At which point, a woman returns to the flat, and it's a different woman. It's not Anne, although she claims to be Anne. And so this is, of course, bewildering for the audience.
Yes.
But gradually, as the play goes on, the audience begins to understand, because it's so skillfully organized, that what we're seeing is Alzheimer's disease seen from the perspective of the sufferer. So that all kinds of strange things are happening, which may or may not really be happening. And the task of the audience is a task which is deliberately not precisely soluble, is to find out what is actually going on.
Yes, well, that's exactly right. As you say, even from the second scene on, there's a really strong sense of dislocation, isn't there? Because of the confusion over who is who. This woman
Yes.
who claims that she's Anne, and there's a man who says he's her husband, but that at other points in the play, Anne will say, "But I'm not married," and then another actor plays the role of
A real
Pierre,
husband, yes.
the real husband, Pierre. And so, as you say, that if you're in the audience, as I recall being when I first saw it, you're really struggling, as you would naturally do, to compute. You're trying to figure out what's going on, and he is deliberately playing with that, of course, so that we come to vicariously understand and feel the confusion that Andre is feeling.
Yes, it's a very simple, but it's a brilliantly original idea. I mean, we've seen in recent years a lot of films and plays about the effects of Alzheimer's, but nothing as really thought-provoking as this, I don't think.
It's also kind of very physically engaging. I mean, I think there is some literal transference going on here, where you are, as you've described, find yourself in the position of Andre, and all of your perceptions are thrown into doubt, like his are. I think there really is some kind of vicarious feeling of uncertainty and dislocation and confusion that we all feel on behalf of him. And so it feels simple when we say that, but it has a profound effect because the effect is an empathy which you wouldn't necessarily otherwise get.
Yeah, and it's not particularly an effect that you would imagine either when you just read the piece. I mean, I know that at the beginning it was quite hard to. We premiered the play at the Studio Theatre, the Euston of the Theatre Royal Bath, which is a 100-seat theatre, because some people were really doubtful about whether this was something an audience would respond to or would indeed sort of tolerate. And even after we opened and we had a sensational set of reviews, I don't think anything I've been involved with has ever had such good reviews, there was still kind of reluctance to risk taking the play to London. People were saying, well, do we really think this is the sort of play that people are going to come and see in a commercial theatre? And so that's why we stepped so carefully, or the management stepped so carefully from Bath to the Tricycle, eventually to the West End, and then they found they hadn't scheduled a long enough run.
So was the concern about the subject matter and how potent that is, or about the form, the dislocating form?
I think it was because it's being treated. It's because it's being treated so originally, and originality always makes people nervous.
I think one of the other ways that it becomes unsettling initially certainly is the set and the setting of the play, because in the first scene, it seems pretty apparent that we're in Andre's apartment in Paris, and that Anne, his daughter, has come to visit, and the carer has been looking after Andre in his flat. However, very quickly thereafter, it becomes uncertain as to whether we are actually in his flat, or at some point in the subsequent scenes, Anne and Pierre say, no, they're in Anne's flat. And of course, that may replicate the fact that Andre is uncertain even about his own surroundings now and identifying where he is. But even in the text, there are some stage directions which talks about it being the same room, but then also goes on and says that as the scenes proceed, the set starts to shed certain elements of furniture until it becomes an emptier, more neutral space. So it becomes less identifiable deliberately. Now in the audience, you're trying to figure out, where are we? It took possibly, I think the first time I saw it, a couple of scenes before I realized things are disappearing off the stage here. What's going on?
Well, it was brilliantly. It was directed by James MacDonald. It was a really beautiful production, and this visual metaphor was very carefully addressed, and it was done very gradually and subtly, so that, as you say, half the time people didn't notice that pieces of furniture and so on were disappearing until suddenly you became aware that the stage was half empty, and eventually it was completely empty, and that was a sort of technical feat to arrange in the blackouts. James had the brilliant idea of playing a piece of Bach, I think probably one of the Goldberg variations, in which suddenly in the 40 seconds or whatever it was that the music was playing, there would be an effect like a needle jumping on a gramophone, so that the piece of music would sort of break up in kind of reflected what was going on in the play.
So the recording of life is skipped somehow.
Yes.
I was going to go back to a point you said about the text. I just reread the play, of course, again, and actually found it quite difficult to follow the through line of the text. And yet, of course, as you say, when it goes on stage, maybe the point is that you can't follow it. So at some point, I was trying to do a timeline, for example, when I just reread the play, and I literally really couldn't figure it out, which scene had preceded which. And obviously this is deliberate. There are numbers of scenes where they repeat themselves partially,
yes,
but with different outcomes. And there's references to things that have been said in a previous scene, but then denied in a latter scene. So you're not sure whether there's any true chronology going on here or not. Were you clear that there was a chronology, or what is actually happening with when it all happens?
I sort of, by the time I finished translating it, I sort of worked out that these were questions it was prudent not to ask. in the sense that, I mean, I said to Florian, "There's no key to this, is there? There's no, oh, I see. That's how I fill up the crossword puzzle." No, it remains sort of fractured, and in a way, I mean, I think of it as a sort of cubist play.
Yes. Oh, that's great. Because I should have known, actually. I did actually realize at some point that I just need to stop, because it can't be resolved entirely.
But we're especially in the theatre, we're so geared to, our whole mental activity has to do with making sense of what's happening before our eyes and situating it.
Yes. And actually also just, you take at face value, don't you, things that are said by characters. So
yes.
In the first, I think it's the first scene, Anne says to her father that she is planning to move to London. And that this, of course, was going to be a challenge if, in terms of her being nearby to look after him, and therefore he will be more in need of care. Obviously, this has practical implications. Subsequent scenes, like even the next few, she denies this, and her partner Pierre denies that this is a plan. No, what are you talking about? She's not going to London. Where did you get this idea from? And yet, towards the very end of the play,
she has moved to.
She has, and you're going, well, who was saying the truth when? Was Andre making some of this up? What was going on?
I think the best way to think of it is that it's Andre's perception of what's happening, and sometimes it's accurate and sometimes it's not. This rational explanation is somewhat disrupted by the fact there are scenes in which Andre doesn't appear.
Yes, well, that's true too. So are we supposed to take those at face value, perhaps?
Well, I don't know. Sometimes they seem to be, and some of the repeated scenes belong to that category as well.
Yes. So he's really confusing us. In fact, I thought a lovely touch and device through the play was Andre's preoccupation with his wristwatch.
Yes.
Which, of course, ironically, is all about time, and he is preoccupied at times as to what time it is. But he also spends a lot of time because he's misplaced his watch, and it's important to him to try and find it. And I was wondering, what did you make of this preoccupation? What was so significant about his watch?
Well, first of all, I think it's a sort of realistic detail. I have no personal experience of Alzheimer's in my family, thank goodness, but a lot of people that we spoke to in the course of the journey confirmed that this is something that often happens, that victims of Alzheimer's lose things because they put them somewhere. I mean, we're familiar with this in everyday life. You put something somewhere because you want to keep it safe, and then you can't, for the life of you, remember where you put it.
Yes.
And this is a sort of exacerbation of that. But it's also, as you say, a metaphor for the fact that time is the enemy, and it's closing in on him.
Yes, and it's somehow a symbol of order, isn't it? It keeps things in order.
Yes.
And it's also a sort of, I found it quite moving actually on a personal level because it's also a feature of personal identity, I think, putting a watch on. And there's another time in the play where it's been organized that he's going to meet one of the new carers, and he's still in his pajamas, and he gets upset about the fact that he's going to be introduced to someone he doesn't know, and he's not dressed. And that's fair enough. I mean, this sort of self-respect and sense of our personal identity is important. And I remembered, for example, after my father died, I found one of the most moving moments for me was when clearing out his possessions was coming across his wristwatch that he'd worn for 40 years. I knew that this was on his wrist every day of his life for like 40 years. And there it was, empty on the top of the dresser.
Yeah.
I think it's significant to Andre to the degree that it's a disproportionate amount of his time is spent focused on, and what appears to be a relatively trivial thing, but of course has, I guess, more kind of emotional meaning to him as he's struggling with things.
Yes.
I think you were right about the observations that the play has about some of the features of dementia. My mother suffered from dementia in her final years, and I know that I recognized, and others who I went to the theater with and saw the play recognized features of this in the behavior, and that made it incredibly telling and poignant, I think. So, for example, sometimes there's a bit of a preoccupation with the past and a lack of understanding about where we are in our lives temporally. Our mind starts being more, well, I don't know whether actually you get invaded by images and memories from the past that almost overtake what's happening in the present. So in the play, Andre has some recollections about his other daughter, Elise. And increasingly, I think he's sort of confused as to where she is and thinks back to her in her childhood. And these are features that I think are not uncommon, aren't they? I mean, my mother lost her short-term memory before her long-term memory. So like you were talking about the watch, Christopher, where you could put something down and not remember where it was, she may not remember the last few hours or days or who she was with yesterday, but she had a very strong memory of some things from the far distant past still.
We had during our rehearsals for the play, we had a visit from a neurologist who explained some of the particular sort of cruelties of this specific condition. It seems that a predisposition to Alzheimer's is likely to start rooting itself in your 20s, so that by the time the symptoms declare themselves, it's like 20 or 30 years later, 40 years later, and it's too late to do anything about these sort of plates which grow between, sort of spread in your brain.
Yes.
He explained to us that if you were able to identify these symptoms early on, you could certainly stop these plates, if we call them that, from growing. And he said that the hope for the future was to try to identify and find a test for this condition before it became irreparable.
Mm-hmm.
Much as, we're told that if cancer is identified very early, you have a much better chance of getting rid of it. The cruelty of the condition is that by the time it arrives, there really isn't anything at all you can do about it.
Yes, well, I hope that these early signs that, increasingly forgetful in your...
No, I think everybody does. Everybody.
Yeah, I'm hoping that's, yes. But I actually was going to return just briefly to the character of Elise, the missing daughter.
Yes.
What role do you think that character play? I mean, we never see Elise. I mean, perhaps just describe a bit about how she features in the play.
One of the things that I guess the condition has made him unguarded, and so he's very inadvertently or otherwise cruel to his older daughter Anne, because he keeps comparing her unfavorably with Elise, who he once describes horribly as the one I loved.
Yes.
In the presence of the other. And there's a sort of revelation about Elise, of course, when we find out what happened to her. But he has forgotten all of those things. In the film, we sort of actualize that a bit by having a painting by Elise, who's called Lucy in the film. In the first half of the film, the painting is above the mantelpiece, and it kind of disappears at some stage.
You don't really know explicitly what happened to her, but you do have a sense that, I mean, she's no longer around. She doesn't visit. Andre believes that she's still alive somewhere and should be visiting him. But I think by the reactions you get from Anne, for example, and reading between the lines, that she may not be alive.
No, I don't think I think she's dead.
Yes.
And he's forgotten that she's dead. I think that's the...
Yes, and there's a reference to an accident later on. But
yeah.
But I mean, the fact that he becomes focused on her, I thought was interesting in a couple of ways. One is, you say that there's this unresolved grief, even perhaps from the past, which he's carrying, that bubbles up, that surfaces, and then he can't even really identify why, but it's still there. That emotional connection is still there, even though he can't articulate it and doesn't realize where it's coming from. That might be where the source of it. But I also was intrigued, as you said, that unguarded or deliberate moment when he says that he preferred Elise to Anne in her presence. I mean, it's extraordinarily cruel for her, who's doing all the work looking after him and is the one left. And for him to say this without inhibition, the impulse to say what he really feels unedited, it's like there's a filter's been removed, and without social propriety, this truth comes out.
Yeah, I think it's another aspect. I think the condition is sort of disinhibiting, typically, and it does cause people to say things that a normal filter would prevent.
So do you think these are truths that the person has always held, but is no longer constrained from expressing?
Yeah, I think so. I think that seems to be the implication. Yes, I mean, I think Florian knows about this because I think his grandmother suffered from it, who he was close to. So yes, I think that you hear about people wandering down the road in their 90 and saying all sorts of terrible things that somehow, they can't prevent themselves from saying.
It's extraordinary. I mean, and again, I have to say, this is, it seemed really accurate to me because my mother displayed some of this behavior, and to her carers. And this was really upsetting for all of us because she would get aggressive with her carers and express,
Yeah.
really vile kinds of views, even racist comments that, we just were shocked by, because this was coming from a highly educated, civilized woman, kind woman, who was, behaving completely not like that. And it was very difficult to live with for everyone around them.
Yes.
And it also felt like, were these truths inside her? I would like to not even think that it all comes down to us maintaining some kind of very shallow social veneer in order to prevent this coming out. Or
these are great mysteries.
Yeah. I thought there were some other traits that were very well observed. There's anger and fear that Andre displays, not quite naturally. He's quite angry with Anne about being contained, and he's doubtful about what's happening to him, and what her motives might be. He lashes out, as we said earlier, to the carer.
Well, one of the things we should, just to veer off at a slight tangent, one of the things that this provides is an astonishing role for an actor. And I think it's no coincidence that Robert Hirsch, who was a great French actor who originated the part in his late 80s, he won the Molière Award, and Ken Cranham won the Olivier, and Frank Langella won the Tony. And when we had our first meeting with Anthony Hopkins, I felt constrained to point out to him that this was not a part that actors would be wise to turn down.
In fact, it has Oscar written all over it. No pressure, Anthony.
Well, actually, he said yes right away and was completely loyal to it throughout, and then became very anxious when it seemed at the time that we planned to shoot it clashed with the shooting dates of the two popes, and we assured him that we would just wait, which we did, because Florian never really wanted anyone else. That was who he wanted to.
It's got that great combination, I think, of both strength and weakness, and also it all going on simultaneously. So this is someone who's, as happens to many, many millions of people, this is someone who is a proud, independent, capable, intelligent, authoritative figure who is being reduced by this disease and is struggling to understand it themselves, fighting it, which there's expressions of anger, fearing it. So as I've said, we see this where, and those moments where he's trying to pretend to others when he himself is clearly aware there's a problem. When, as you said earlier, when he can't identify who the son-in-law is, he's still trying to pretend that he does. And there are moments where he has lucidity and he lashes out in anger and frustration, perhaps at the way he's being treated. All of which is a fantastic mix, I think, for, as you've said, for an actor. There's an extraordinary scene in terms of fear and things. A couple of extraordinary scenes where he has with Pierre, or the man, which we take to be Pierre, and Pierre threatens him, physically even, slaps him. And this is really shocking in the context of the play, because Pierre says some truths to him, like, how long are you going to keep hanging around, making your daughter's life a misery? In other words, would you just get on and die and leave us in peace? And then literally attacks him. But we never know. We never know whether that actually has happened, or whether it's a sort of function of his paranoia, or part of the condition, or what. And in that respect, I think it's probably relevant to remark that Florian is a fervent admirer of Harold Pinter, that he really has absorbed a lot of the original lessons, that original features that Harold introduced into the theatre, including this kind of dark undercurrent of menace, which is a feature of the scene you've described. It is, because as you say, you're not certain whether it really happens or not. You wonder whether it's Andre's projection somehow of he instinctively senses some resent from Pierre, or that expresses itself in this way. But it's interesting you mentioned Pinter, because there is a question: are Anne and Pierre actually really manipulating him? Is it just paranoia? What is the real status? And that's very Pinteresque, that undercurrent of not sure what the real relationships are, and that there could be some potential danger or menace involved.
Yes, in those scenes in particular, I think, however, the sort of anguish that Anne feels is genuine, and I think we see enough to know that she really only moves him into the nursing home as a last resort, and she feels terribly guilty about it, and she hates having to do it. And there's a very, very moving moment towards the end where you see that he understands why she's done it and that she's doing the right thing. Just for a moment, it sort of dawns on him that this is the only solution, and he's tender with her, which he hasn't really been at all during the rest of the play.
Yeah, that's a really good point. There's that moment of awareness where he also includes a recognition, I think they share, that Elise is no longer around.
Yes.
In that same moment, and there is that coming together, and he recognizes this very momentarily. And it's interesting you're saying about Anne. I agree with you that we shouldn't overstate the Pinter aspect of that scene, because I think on balance we probably believe that Andre is somehow imagining that this hasn't really occurred. But again, it's not necessarily about the literal fact of it. It's more about what its emotional meaning is. And although the play is called The Father, and it's obviously very much about with that lead role and his condition, the impact on Anne, and from Anne's perspective, is also, I think, really well observed. She has a thankless, very challenging part to play. She expresses all of that in the frustration, the fatigue, as you say, the heartbreak. Particularly, for example, watching the kind of regression that her father is suffering. I think that's one of the hardest things, is to watch someone who you've known as your authoritative parent, the father figure, literally reduced to the degree that they are. So she has this heartbreaking scene where she says that he's asked her to sing him a lullaby when he's gone to bed, as if she were his own mother.
Yeah.
And that, he's actually regressed to second childhood in Shakespearean sense. And that's horrible to witness, I think, for any child about their parent. So I think that's really well observed from the perspective of the child, which actually happens at the very end of the play, doesn't it, Christopher, where he's left, again, almost calling for his mother?
He's calling for his mother at the end, yeah, and asking when she's going to come and see him.
It's a pretty hard thing to watch and to leave the play with. What did you make of that as an ending? That this is, it's...
Well, it's tough, but it's truthful. And really, I think all great plays don't flinch from the truth. And this is one of them. And it takes you to the very end. And if that's done with enough power and conviction, I think it is paradoxically sort of weirdly uplifting at the end.
So that's an interesting point, because I remember reading many years ago, I think it was V.S. Naipaul, who was responding perhaps to a critic or a reader, someone who was saying that his novel was too pessimistic. And he I think, referred to Hardy, and he said, and maybe it was Hardy's reaction as well, he says, it's not about pessimism, it's about truth. And partly you're thinking, so is recognizing truth in art ultimately uplifting, even if paradoxically it's so despairing?
Yes.
Would you?
I would say very unequivocally, I would say absolutely yes. That's what we look for in art. More than anything else, I think, is the recognition of some difficult to acknowledge truth.
Well, we've certainly got it here, I think. And actually, I was going to just, one other thing I was going to say about Anne. We talked about scenes in the play where Andre isn't on the stage, where she mainly is, but there's a quite distinctive scene, isn't there, where Anne has a monologue, a quite lengthy monologue, where she describes a dream she's had, this is not like the rest of the play in terms of the dialogue.
No, it's not. I said I remember saying to Florian, this is completely outside the sort of technique of the play in a way. Why did you do it? And he said, I have no idea. It just seemed to impose itself. And I think it's sort of a sign of the really best writers is that they can't really explain what's come into their mind at the time of writing. It's just something that imposes itself.
That's fascinating because it is a different form to the rest of the play, and yet I guess I was trying to interpret what it was because she basically has a dream where she says that she had in a wave of hatred she strangles her father in his bed.
Yeah.
And when he's dead or dying, he smiles as if thanking her.
Yeah.
So I guess it represents some of the true frustration she may be having, but also some instinct that, ultimately it would be better off, he will be better off when he's dead, that this is no way to live for either of them.
Yes.
And I know that millions will feel this in some way at some point. With my mother, I'm sure we were thinking this is not the life she deserves or should be living anymore. It's hard to express that, obviously, literally.
Well, as Catherine Hepburn remarked, old age is not for sissies.
No, my mother used to use that very phrase. She obviously stole it from Catherine Hepburn. I also wanted to ask you, Christopher, that The Father is actually one of 3 plays that Florian has written and you have translated that I suppose could be loosely labeled as a trilogy.
Yeah.
If only because of the similarities in their titles, the others being The Mother and The Son. And there are a few of the same character names, but I don't believe that they're the same characters per se. So
No. He always uses a limited palette of names. The hero in The Height of the Storm is called Andre and that's his name for old men. And
there's a Pierre and an Anne, I think.
Yeah, that's right.
And others of them. So what is the connection?
Well, he wrote The Mother first. First of all, he was a novelist in his 20s. He was a very successful novelist. And I think by chance he was asked to do something in an opera, for an opera. I can't quite remember the details, but in any case, he suddenly violently fell in love with the theatre and started to write plays. And maybe his 3rd or 4th play was called The Mother and was a great success and treats in the way that The Father deals around the subject of Alzheimer's. The Mother is about an intelligent woman who finds herself, it's what's known as empty nest syndrome, when the adored son has left and the marriage has gone sour. And it's a play that describes, again, not in a entirely coherent, logical way, but it describes a nervous breakdown.
Yes.
And I think in that play he sort of found his form. Then wrote 2 or 3 other kinds of plays, mostly comedies, and then came back and wrote The Father, and eventually wrote The Son, which I think is the one that is closest to his heart, in fact, because it sort of reflects aspects of his life in a more personal way than the other plays.
It's a disturbing piece as well because it's all about teenage mental illness.
Yes, it is. That's
the
right.
impact of divorce and adjusting to having multiple families, but most particularly and poignantly about teenage mental illness.
Yeah.
And so I was just trying to understand what these plays had in common, or what his intent was. They're all domestic dramas in some form, but intense.
Yes, they all arrive at a moment of crisis and explore a moment of crisis within the relevant family.
Exactly. And as you said at the very top, they all do that by exploring a different form. It's they're not linear. The forms somehow reflect the disruption that's going on in their lives.
Yeah, interestingly enough, the son is the one that plays least with these devices.
That's true. I think there's a scene though early on where they wreck the interior of the house and they just leave all the mess lying around, and nobody refers to the fact that he's just destroyed the house.
Yeah, they're images. He always has in his head what the stage is going to look like. He's very vividly aware of the visual aspects of his plays.
Well, The Father, there is that sort of emptiness of the white stage as it progressively empties stays with you. And I remember in The Son, isn't there something where he's writing on the wall?
Yes, I think that was a directorial flourish. But certainly the scene where he trashes the place and everything just stays on the floor for the next few scenes,
Yes.
and nobody taking any notice of it, is actually rather a powerful metaphor for the presence of a disruptive adolescence in the house.
Yes. And what's inside his own head. I'm very excited, of course, to see the film of the father that you've co-written. I wanted to ask you how you went about transferring the play to film, particularly given what we've just been talking about, the setting of the play, which is deliberately restricted to a single room, and how that empties of furniture and represents to some degree Andre's claustrophobia or the blankness of what's going on inside his mind, his mental condition. Film, as you've so much experience translating work to that medium, generally usually opens up the world.
Yeah.
How did you treat that in this case?
Well, we had an opening conversation where I said, well, a certain kind of director could really go to town on this. There could be all kinds of cinematic devices, like, you could be looking from Andre's point of view one moment, and then when you would do the reverse angle, something completely other is happening all of those possibilities are there. But both of us felt very strongly that we should try to keep it as simple as possible, and that we shouldn't make it over elaborate, and that we should find a sort of cinematic equivalent to that sort of stripping away that we've described in the play. And so it is. I mean, the way it was done was, I've never worked on a film in this particular way before. We had a conversation about it, as I've said, quite a sort of extensive conversation. And then Florian wrote a draft in French. I then translated it into English and sort of changed bits and messed about with it a bit and sent it back to him. And he then wrote another draft in French. And I wrote a fourth draft in English. And then I went to Paris for a week, less than a week, I think. And we just negotiated our way through the script. But by the end of the week, we had something that we were both happy with, we were both agreed on. And then, Florian decided that he wanted to direct it. And that was also a very wise decision. A slight background to this is that there has already been a film of the father in France. It was called Florida, Floride, and took place in America, and was so far away from the play that it's virtually unrecognizable, and Florian was very, very unhappy with it. And so, unusually in France, being as civilized a country as it is, something that you write makes you the owner of it. Whereas throughout the American and sort of Anglo-Saxon film world, a screenplay that you write immediately belongs to the person who's paid you, and there's nothing you can do about it ever again. But in France, the idea of him having another go at something that had already been filmed seemed to be perfectly acceptable. And so he already, as it were, had a kind of a film and a style in mind, which was almost a reaction to the film that had already been made. And it's a very sort of, as I say, simple. It's very austere, and all the more powerful for it, I think. And it puts the emphasis on the actors, which is what his work also does. Actors love being in his plays because they can find enormous range of feelings to explore within the characters.
Yes, I was going to say, I think from what you're saying, it sounds just as well that he's been able to return and preserve some of what's originally powerful about the play, which is the characters of the father and Anne in particular, and their relationship, and with the actors that you have in the film. That's going to be wonderful to watch. And actually, because it's really about what's going on inside this man's head, largely, that's where you want to be. And you want to see that reflected from him, not necessarily on some projection to represent it.
No, we had a set built in a studio in London, and the set was just gradually modified. It's even more difficult to be aware of than it is in the theatre. In a way, it's just
more subtle.
More subtle. It's just that something about the apartment is changing all the time, but you can't quite put your finger on it.
So I was gonna ask you very specifically about that, but you've given the clue away now. I will be looking for it, of course, when I come to watch it. Yes, because again, being literal, how are you going to represent that? And do you go outside the flat itself? Do you?
You look out of the window and you go out with Anne in the streets a bit, but not much.
No, and I suppose actually Anne does go out in the world, but the father seems to be occupying his own world.
Yeah.
Well, it's fascinating. Thank you, Christopher. We've come to the end of our time, I think, and it's been wonderful to talk to you about the father and the film, the play and the film. One of the traditions of our podcast is that I like to ask my guest if you could recommend a play that we could talk about in a future episode. Now, I realize that given the vast extent of the canon with which you're familiar, it might be difficult to single one out, but is there a play that's a personal favorite?
Well, yes, actually, there is. Of the five Ibsen plays that I've translated, the one I really love is The Wild Duck.
Ah,
And I don't know whether you've ever done that.
I haven't yet. We did The Doll's House as the very first one, and I would love to do The Wild Duck. I thought, a really interesting production at the Almeida a year or two ago. Did you? I don't know whether you saw that.
Yes, I did it for the National Theatre in 1979, a cast including Ralph Richardson and Michael Bryant and Stephen Moore
Oh, wow.
and Yvonne Bryceland for the Olivier, actually. Christopher Morahan directed it. And then I was sort of reunited with it a year or so, more than a year ago, I think, when I was asked to adapt it for the radio. It started off as a slight sort of culture shock because they told me that Radio 3 could not broadcast a play that lasted longer than 2 hours. I was rather shocked by that, but it's their policy now. So, having reacted rather negatively, I then sort of started to look at the play, and I got the notion of cutting the entire first act and kind of feeding in the information from the first act, which actually you can quite easily do. This enables you to do the play with one set and about half the number of. The first act has a different set and 7 characters who never appear again. So, as a matter of practicality, it's quite a useful thing for companies to look at. And I didn't feel that we'd sold the play short in any way, or that there was anything that we'd sort of missed out. And that reunited me with the play and made me remember what a wonderful play I think it is.
Yes, it's interesting how you can now do some of these adaptations, of course, I guess, of out of copyright. Although even in Norway, I'm not even sure there was copyright in Norway when he first wrote these plays, weirdly.
No, I don't think so, because I think in the case of Doll's House, the first time it was done in English, the play was called Breaking a Butterfly.
Yes.
And had a happy ending.
Yeah, they butchered it. Yes, that's right. Is your second version of The Wild Duck in print, or is that... Oh, you could hear it on BBC Radio 3 somewhere, maybe, BBC Sounds.
Yes, you can hear it, I think, on Radio 3, but I'm hoping that at some point in the near future, somebody will do it on stage, and at that point, you can start looking for a publisher. It's hard to find a publisher on the basis of it just having been done once on the radio.
As I know well. Well, that's a great suggestion, and I'm going to seek that out on the radio and your original text as well, and I'll try and do it some point on the podcast. Maybe I'll have to call you back, Christopher, for that one.
Fine. I'm happy to do that.
Thank you so much for joining me today. It's been a privilege to talk with you about the play. As the curtain falls on the father left in the lonely care of his nurses, how do we leave the theatre with any sense of hope for our futures in old age, either for ourselves or for our loved ones, other than with a strong sense of empathy for others who may share the same challenges, heartbreak, and love that we do as we cling on to what it is to be alive? Thanks for listening, and see you next time.
Thanks for listening. To listen to other episodes, to find out news about future episodes, or to leave comments about what you've heard, please visit us at www.theplaypodcast.com. You can also follow us on Facebook or on Twitter at theplaypod. You're also welcome to email plays@theplaypodcast.com to suggest plays that we could talk about in future episodes. You can also register your suggestion on the website. Thanks again, and see you next time.